Be seated, please.
The hearing has been.
Yes, Dr. Dunn, when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Chief Commissioner. I'll just see where I... Okey-dokey. Pardon me if I repeat myself slightly. To resume, thank you very much, Commissioners. So essentially, while we have both federal and state budgets making strong, indeed stronger forecasts for economic growth than just a few months previously, wages are simply not responding in the same way that a supply and demand model of the labour market would expect. They are responding, however, in the ways that the monopsony model would expect, which is why we are arguing for the strength of an institutional action on wage increases. I've already mentioned, of course, the lack of response by wages to growth in the economy, and particularly the labour market tightening that was notable on page 35 of the Treasury's presentation. I've also made the note about the ANZ Roy Morgan Australian Consumer Confidence Survey, showing that consumer confidence was declining in, or had decreased, I should say, in Victoria, South Australia and WA, particularly around sub-indices that capture the financial situation compared to a year ago, and whether or not it is a good time to buy a household item. Now, these results reinforce the information provided by Unions WA in our initial submission concerning the results of the survey report on job and wage insecurity among working Western Australians. Even for those in secure jobs, life is often lived close to the financial breadline, with 1 in 3 reporting that they are either going further into debt or just meeting the costs of living. Now, the Chamber of Commerce and Industry has sought to minimise the results of this survey based on what they say are a lack of controls and sample sizes. However, I would refer the Commission in Court session to pages 2 to 3 of the Job and Wage Insecurity in Western Australia report, which Unions WA submitted as an attachment to our initial submission.
Yes.
That details the methodology of the survey, setting out that we weighed and adjusted our results with reference to Australian Bureau of Statistics data on household and personal incomes. We also have had a separate comparison using data from the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia, or HILDA survey. Looking at the HILDA data specifically, courtesy of Professor Alison Preston of UWA, we found that the results between the responders who say they are just getting by, quote unquote, just getting by in HILDA, are like those who say that my income is just meeting the costs of living. So while we acknowledge that our survey, like any survey, certainly has limitations, we feel it's significant that its results are consistent with other more established surveys. HILDA also measures of consumer confidence. Taken together, they should be regarded as a warning sign to government and business in WA that if we allow real wages to go backwards, a fall in consumer and household consumption is coming. Relying on elevated levels of household savings are simply not going to do the job of a real wage increase when it comes to maintaining consumer and household spending, particularly as, when we are talking about low wage workers, we are not talking about people with high savings to begin with. The Chief Commissioner pointed to the paradoxical situation of seeming to have a high saving and a high consumption rate. We would argue that relying on the continuance of that paradoxical situation is indeed the risky option here. The situation is further compounded when we are discussing the divergence between discretionary and non-discretionary inflation. This was highlighted by the ABS March quarter This was highlighted by the ABS March quarter CPI release, and is also in both the WACOS submission and the union's WA submission. If you see our paragraph 4.4 of our initial submission onwards. I would, of course, at this point have put my papers down on my other thing, if you'll just bear with me for a moment, Commissioners.
Yes, certainly.
Here we go. So just to reiterate that point, Commissioners, what we had for the non-discretionary inflation was a result of a change from the previous quarter of 3% and a change from the previous year of 6.6%. I think you should be able to see that in the charts. So the 7.6%, I should say, that of the union's WA claim and also the claim by WACOS, which is probably best seen in the context of a figure like that. Now, mention or reference has been made to the 2020, 2021, 2022 Fair Work Commission annual wage review experimental estimates of a consumer price index for low-paid employees, where the authors used CPI and the selected living cost indexes to measure the spending patterns of low-paid employee households and compare them to higher households. Now, it is true, as the Minister pointed out previously, that they did not find large differences, although we make the point along with the Minister that the survey was taking place during perhaps a more calmer period, if you like, of wages. But it is notable that there, in the context of sharp divergences between discretionary and non-discretionary inflation, so once again referring back to that chart, then that chart about the 6.6% annual non-discretionary versus 2.7% discretionary, these smaller differences can become bigger in the context of volatility. And it's also worth remembering, by the way, that discretionary spending refers to items such as recreation, entertainment, etc., that consumers purchase when they have enough income left over after paying the necessary expenses on matters like housing and utilities, etc. A situation where consumers would need to cut back on discretionary spending in order to make up for non-discretionary spending will be bad for the businesses that supply those discretionary goods and services. The Minister's submission points out, in reply I should say, points out at its paragraph 11 that most business industries have experienced robust employment growth in Western Australia over the past 12 months, with a majority of industries have also experienced an increase in aggregate income over this period, as measured through the gross operating surplus plus gross mixed income. Unions WA notes this particular passage because it goes somewhat to the points about whether there are inflationary impacts that are likely to emerge from an increase to the minimum wage. We'd call the Commission's attention to some testimony by the Federal Treasury Secretary, Dr. Stephen Kennedy, who testified before the Senate Economics Legislation Committee on the 16th of February 2022 that, and I quote, "If we can achieve productivity growth of 1.5% and assuming sort of an inflation growth of 2.5%, then nominal wages can grow at 4% and put no pressure on inflation. On the other hand, if productivity is at 0.5%, then wages can only grow at 3% before they put pressure on inflation." So our view would be that if you consider the increases in inflation, the increases in what we're asking for, and the notable increases in productivity. Productivity has still gone up. Productivity has still gone up in Australia. Productivity has still gone up in WA. And in that sense, there is no reason to assume that even a strong increase in the minimum wage, such as 7.6, would in fact necessarily have the deleterious and impact on wage push inflation that is about which the alarm is sounded in certain quarters. The 7.6 is, in this sense, is a modest recognition of cost inflation increases that have already occurred. The Minister also notes that in paragraph 4.1 of the CCI-WA submission, it refers, as it has done in its verbal submissions, to the dominance of the resources sector in driving WA's economic growth, and states that this is not reflected in other sectors of the economy. So they have their graph 11, industry contributions to gross state product in WA, showing mining sort of out at 169.6 billion, and then you're down into areas like 18.2 billion for construction and things like that. Now, the relevance of this chart to the minimum wage case appears to be a sense that other WA industries, which employ far more people than mining, taken on their own and together, are essentially free-riding passengers on the big ship mining. We would draw the Commission's attention to the WA Government's Invest and Trade in WA website, which provides a list of reasons why businesses should invest in Western Australia. Now, these include, and I think we should make this point in the context of rebounding business investment, which the Treasury pointed out, they include our cultural diversity and location near Asia, our stability and experience in enabling major projects and developing complex supply chains, our highly skilled workforce and modern infrastructure, our technical and environmental expertise, modern industrial zones, some of the world's largest ports, our clean and productive soils and waters, producing a range of premium foods and beverages, our consistent rating as one of the most livable places on earth. All of these are products of the industries that are very low on the CCI's contribution to GSP chart, but without them, the mining industry and the resources industry generally would be in real trouble. Public sector workers looking after healthcare, education and the rule of law, agricultural workers looking at the food we eat, retail and hospitality workers ensuring the supply of necessities and ensuring the quality of our life. During the COVID-19 pandemic and before it, these workers were on the front line of making life worth living generally and making it possible for the mining industry to operate at all in Western Australia. So they have earned the right to claim their fair share of the wealth in WA. The mining industry's big number is not a special claim that somehow just sets aside workers in the non-mining sectors of a wage increase, particularly a minimum wage increase. All of those workers have contributed to those very large figures. It doesn't get sort of linked in a sort of raw number, but nevertheless it's there and it's real. And one of the reasons we have a minimum wage system at all is precisely to acknowledge the contribution that all of those workers make. So to conclude, Commissioners, we would say that to meet the needs of the low paid, there is a need for binding institutional increases to wages, such as those of the minimum wage. The disjunction between low real wage growth and strong economic growth, or indeed zero real wage growth, must be addressed by decisions of industrial tribunals. And one of the reasons for that is that the cost of living in WA has increased dramatically, and the divergence between discretionary and non-discretionary CPI inflation should be noted when considering matters to do with the cost of living. The vacancy data for WA shows that employees are in demand, but this is not a situation where real wages are responding. Workers are being paid less than the full value of their outlook, given that the WA economy is such a standout performer in the Australian economy generally. In terms of ongoing skills development, we of course recognise what the Minister has said and what we have also said in our initial submission. Unless regular and reasonable increases in apprenticeship wages flow on from decisions such as those of the minimum wage, apprenticeships will become increasingly unattractive. So apprentice and trainee wages should be lifted in the usual way, in order to attract new entrants and recognise increased demand. It's already been stated that vulnerable groups of employees such as female workers are overrepresented within the state industrial relations system, in those private sectors of the state industrial relations system. Workers with this profile are less likely to negotiate their own agreements and are more likely to be award reliant within the state system. We would say that growth forecasts for both the WA and national economy are extremely positive, notwithstanding the points that are made about volatility. Both economies are well placed to increase minimum and award wages in such a way that maintains and materially improves the standards of living of low-wage workers. And the lack of wage growth in WA and Australia deprives from the power of employers to decline, or at least resist, the need to increase wages. And Unions WA contends that both WA and Australian economies are not only recovering quickly from the pandemic, but are well placed to make increases to minimum and award wages that compensate for the rising cost of living and, as I said before, materially improve people's lives. On the state wage principles, Unions WA is supportive of the Minister's proposed amendment to the equal remuneration principle. We are not ourselves proposing changes to those principles. So if it pleases the Commission, we will conclude our presentation. We, of course, like others, reserve the right to respond to other submissions, and if there are any questions, certainly happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diamond. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's true.
Thank you. If it pleases the Commission in court session, I'll give a brief overview of the above submission and go to questions. Can I start by saying Kaya Nalakari Wajak Nunga Mort, Kan Karak Nichipuja, just acknowledging the land on which we're meeting. Waikos's submission is that an increase to the state minimum wage of 7.6% or $59.20 is essential to meet the needs of low paid and contribute to improve living standards for employees. Our main focus has been on the state minimum wage in particular, because that's where we feel we have the most relevant expertise to provide, although of course we do very much have an interest and concern for the female dominated care industry as well. And so sitting behind this, for us, there's a key principle that the state minimum wage should be growing ahead of the cost of living, and especially ahead of the cost of essential living costs and non-discretionary items. And so while we've referred to as Unions WA have that 7.6%, the other really key figure for us is that national non-discretionary inflation increased by 6.6% over the last year and 3% in the last quarter. So we don't have an equivalent at the WA level, but that for us is the big concern, and that's particularly because from our point of view, workers and households reliant on the state minimum wage are spending much more of their income on non-discretionary items. And so the key issues for us are around rising living costs and increasing levels of hardship that we're seeing in working households in WA. And one of the concerns that we'd highlight is that this isn't necessarily appearing that well, as we discussed this morning, in the headline WA Treasury figures. And the concern is that the signals that we have is that we've got quite a strong and healthy WA economy. Most households in WA are doing well and are doing better than they have, but that's also hiding a growing inequality and divide. And so our concern is that there's a cohort of individuals and households, and particularly those reliant on the minimum wage, and also, as my other colleagues have pointed out, those with a mix of income support measures who we've seen falling behind. And they've been falling behind particularly on housing costs, then food and other essential goods and services. We are also concerned about the wider whole of economy issues within the current environment, and that question of how do we get the balance right between wages and prices. So, and one of our concerns there, as well as the capacity of households to participate and contribute in our domestic economy. So we have heard and we understand the concerns raised by small business of their capacity to pay. We'd say the flip side to that is their capacity to pay increased wages goes to a proportion of their turnover. But if spending drops dramatically, that hits the whole of their turnover. So it is important to get the balance there. And we are concerned that if we do see an extended economic downturn, that they will be at the front line of that impact. Couple of key points I wanted to talk to. I mentioned that thing about non-discretionary inflation. There's the table on page 7 of our submission where we'd highlighted that. The other thing that follows on from that in particular is the issue around the increase in rent in Perth that was 9.7% last year and 2.3% in the last quarter, and that follows consistent rises over the last decade. And so one thing in terms of considering the adequacy of the state minimum wage, it kind of goes to that principle around how do you get the balance of what do you need for an adequate and decent income. And one thing that we'd note is looking back to, say, going back to the Henderson report on poverty, which has been the foundation for a lot of what we've done. At that point in time, the cost of rental housing was less than half of the budget compared to what it is now for the average household budget. So we're talking about 58% of the state minimum wage at the moment. Back at that point, it was more like 25%. So there's been quite a dramatic increase in the cost of housing and its contribution to the cost of living. And I think this also goes to some of the issues around the international comparisons with the OECD. Yes, we've got a higher rate that we're paying for our minimum wage compared to the OECD. We've seen very clearly those minimum wage principles are growing strongly there, but their housing hasn't been growing over the last decade or two. In fact, their housing affordability stayed at a comparative level over a period where ours has doubled. And so we have to look at the adequacy of how we're meeting the cost here. And unfortunately for low-income households, housing and rent is the thing that's blowing that out. Look, the other issue that we discussed a little bit earlier that I'd again remind you of is that we're in this period at the moment where we've seen record low unemployment and high participation, but have not seen rising wages. We're very concerned by what this signals about, our assumptions around how the economy should work and what are the controlling mechanisms that make sure that working households aren't being left behind. And that's why we think at this point the decision around the minimum wage in particular is really important to make sure that gap is not increasing. And certainly as we heard today, there are projections around the wage price index rising, but at the moment we're actually not seeing what the mechanism is for that as clearly. And we've seen this disconnect between what's happened with, highest participation rate, lowest unemployment, then, that index of demand has gone up so high, but we haven't seen wages respond yet. So I guess in the Commission's deliberations, you really need to be thinking about, yes, there's a question to what extent is this a spike or is this an ongoing rise, but then what is this really meaning for the adequacy of that minimum wage for households simply being able to find and be able to maintain a place to live. So I mentioned, median rent for a house is 58% of the state minimum wage. Median rent for a unit is nearly 53%. We also provided some detail and analysis, so you've seen that on page 10, and then on page 11 and on, we had some of the material from the Anglicare Rental Affordability Snapshot. And this actually shows one of the things that increases this pressure for minimum wage and low-income working households is the availability of affordable rental properties. And so it highlights that only 1.4% of the properties that were available for rent during that period in Perth were affordable to someone on the state minimum wage. 1.7% in the southwest, only 1%, or literally 2 properties in the northwest. And so that's one of the things that's causing a real crunch there. The other thing that I would highlight, if you go on to page 13 and 14, we've provided some heat maps there around housing affordability and availability. What this then highlights is that the places that are affordable are in those fringe suburbs where you're far from work, you're far from services, the cost of transport, getting access to things is greater. And so again, there's this risk that even where you can find something that's affordable, it's pushing up your living costs because you're being pushed to the fringe there. So the other things that we did highlight were around food security and food stress. And I do note my colleagues' comments around being clear about how much of that applies to award wage or minimum wage households. And one of the important facts there was from that Food Bank Hunger report was that 64% of the households they were dealing with who were food insecure were employed. So what we've tried to do all the way through the evidence, because we're aware of this concern that a lot of the evidence and data that we work with is focused around low-income households and households living in poverty. So we've done our best this year to go through and try and say what percentage of those are wage, what percent. It's difficult for us to find the evidence to be able to say specifically state minimum wage, but we've certainly got full-time and part-time employed there. Similar evidence there around food prices. We've seen, both from Woolworths and Coles, 4.3% and 3.2% rises in the first quarter alone, which is a dramatic increase in the household grocery bill. And similarly from the low pay report that Waycross did with Unions WA, it also highlighted that behind housing, food is the second highest weekly budget priority for low wage households. So when it comes to considering adequacy, it's the cost of housing, then it's the cost of food, and then it's the cost of transport and other essential services behind that. I did want to go to one of the points that was raised both in the Minister and CCI's submission, was talking around targeted measures for the cost of living. And I guess there's 2 points here. One is we're not saying that increasing the state minimum wage is a solution to cost of living or poverty problems. What we are saying is that the Commission needs to consider in what counts as an adequate wage, the capacity of people on that wage to be able to meet the cost of living, to not be living in poverty. So I guess my concern was that there were some suggestions that the $400 electricity credit was a targeted solution, and the comment that the state minimum wage was a very blunt instrument. Actually, when it came to that 400, the Treasurer, who's also the Premier, in announcing it, admitted it's not a target measure. It goes to all households, and in fact has acknowledged that if you own a holiday home, you get twice the amount coming through. But the problem and the challenge for Treasury here is they don't have access to the data to target. What they could do is boost the amount that's going to those concessional households or those with concession cards. One of the things that is very welcome and that we've acknowledged in this measure is that it means that it does reach those low-income working households who won't have a concession card. So that is a positive there, but it's certainly not a targeted measure. Whereas I would say very strongly that the state minimum wage is very targeted in the impact that it has on low-income workers and low-income households. And so, if anything, you've got more capacity there to respond in a targeted way to the impact of cost of living on low-income and vulnerable households in WA. And look, this also goes to, I suppose, some of the critique of the low pay report that we put together. We recognise that the numbers we've been able to survey there are comparatively small. I would say that there's been a great challenge for us. I mean, when it comes to being able to provide the evidence to the Commission around the impacts, we've deliberately gone together and pulled our resources to try and find what can we get that's the strongest evidence that goes to the capacity to pay and the impacts on those on the minimum wage. And so, this is the best data that we've seen around this in a long time. And we did specifically have the data there that allows us to say, who's part-time, who's full-time, who's on less than 52,000 before tax and so on. And so, it was very telling that we had 2/3, 66.3% of workers with an annual household income less than 52,000, reporting they had $100 a week or less left over. That, 15.4% were saying they were falling behind and falling into debt. 39% were saying their income was just enough to meet their cost of living. For us, the finding of the report was very clear that access to full-time work in itself was no longer the guarantee it used to be to being able to maintain an adequate and decent standard of living. And also this then combines and backs up the evidence that we gave from emergency relief providers about those who are employed full-time and finding themselves in financial stress and debt. And certainly the pattern of what we got from emergency relief providers is they said they were seeing a whole new group of people coming forward to them, or they were seeing people that they hadn't seen for 5 years or more who were coming back because their circumstances had changed and they were now finding themselves in financial hardship. So what we've done there to the best of our ability is give you the best evidence that we could find around the impacts on low-income working households. So particularly with that, I'd like to focus on the recent poverty analysis, the Poverty and Disadvantage report from Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre. So this is the latest data we've been able to get anywhere at that scale. It's based on the 2020 Hilda data. All of the other national kind of poverty inequality reports are based on 2018 ABS data. So this is the best that we could get our hands on. What it did show was that nearly 20% of people who were living below the poverty line were also working, and that 8.8% of those living in poverty were in full-time employment. There's a good table and chart on page 33 that goes to, it shows households, persons and numbers of children, and gives the poverty line and the percentages there. The other thing that's interesting there is there's also the breakdown by family types in comparison to the poverty rates. So roughly what that shows, and there, those numbers, I should say, have used the 50% poverty line, whereas we know that the considerations around the federal case, they've always focused on 60% as being the appropriate measure for the federal minimum wage. What they do show is, using those numbers, you've got roughly 64,000 West Australians living in poverty who are working, and that 29,000 of those are actually working full time. So for us, that's a very strong indicator. The other thing that we did highlight was that growing gap in inequality in wages between the state minimum wage and average weekly earnings. So we had that chart there, I think was, sorry, I've lost track of the page. But I think that the point that highlighted was that at state level...
Page 38?
Yes, that's the one, sorry.
Right in the middle.
Thank you. Well, a couple of things highlighted there. One is that state minimum wage is 41% of average weekly earnings here, when we compare to the national minimum wage is 44.2%. And obviously, part of this goes to this issue around income inequality in WA, that we've got some households that are doing dramatically better at the moment, and our economy is very strong, but we're seeing this hollowing out and growing inequality. So the state minimum wage is currently $167 below that 60% median earning poverty line as of November 2021. And the evidence, and again the data today around WPI, is that we're facing the slowest rate of wage growth since WPI was first established in 1997, and today's numbers confirm that, and they in fact said, we also saw that ANZ report saying that we're looking at the largest fall in real wage growth for 20 years. That was in the edition that I think the Minister's additional... No, sorry, that was the UWA one. Sorry, my apologies. Just in wrapping up, a couple of other issues that kind of came up today that again we wanted to highlight. One was the gender wage gap, and that Western Australia has the widest gender pay gap in the nation at 21.2%. This is a big concern for us, particularly when it comes to the issues around equal remuneration and gender equity, and the big concerns that we're seeing around women who are working in the care economy not being paid the true value of their labour. And so this is a big thing for us, and we're hoping to do more work and bring more stuff back to you next year around those issues. It was important to note that the Western Australian Government, the Minister's submission also highlighted this in terms of the higher incidence of award reliance among female employees as around why the award wage rate process is so important to gender pay equity and gender pay considerations. I also mentioned earlier the issues around young people. So the 74.7% of all WA employees whose hourly wage is at or less than the national minimum wage aged 18 to 24. We've previously spoken, and there's plenty of research around that points to the impacts that we've seen around prior economic downturns and recessions on young workers who are entering the labour market around the time of a recession, and we know that those things have lifelong impacts. It can take a decade or more for them to bounce back. And so for us, the risk to them during a period where there's high rising costs of living and so on, is that it can have a long-term impact on their development and progression through their careers and their risk of living in poverty. I did note with interest the discussion around disability work and changes as well. That's something that we at WACOS haven't got our heads across yet, and we want to go and look at. Generally, we've tended to rely on the consumer and the sector peaks in that area, so people with disability and National Disability Services Australia to highlight those issues for us, but we know that that's an area of big concern, and in the discussions we were having last week around the budget, we had a number of services who were actually putting up their hand and saying, well, we're told participation's at an all-time high, unemployment's at an all-time low, but actually the unemployment rate for people with a disability has not shifted at all. And so again, we're really keen to see more happen in that area. Just let me check what else I really wanted to say before wrapping up. I think I've pretty much covered all of those issues. So in concluding, the important issue for us is that state minimum wage really needs to stay ahead of the cost of living, and particularly the cost of those essential items. And we're concerned about the impact that can be had if we are facing a time of rising costs, rising inflation, that can have on those low-income households and the longer-term impacts that can have. As we detailed in our low pay report, Western Australian workers, when we went and spoke to them specifically, told us that they felt their wages simply not increasing by the same proportion as their living costs. They felt stressed, they felt like that they were falling behind. They spoke of challenges that it included, like having to access their savings or superannuation simply to get by, turning to emergency relief services or food relief services for the first time, or being forced to cut their spending on essential items like healthcare and education, and things that we know will have a long-term impact on their health and well-being and their productivity and their contribution to the wider economy. From our point of view, a strong minimum wage, one which ensures workers are provided with a decent living standard well above the poverty line, is integral for an inclusive and sustainable economy where the benefits are shared with all West Australians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Twomey.
Any questions?
No, thank you very much. Are there any general replies from anyone at the bar table to what's been put by either of you?
Um,
Mr. Entringham? We'll just work our way along the bar table.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. I didn't have any specific issues to raise in reply. I was just going to actually ask a very general question. There's another opportunity to put in submissions post the national accounts data that comes out on the
Yes,
1st of June.
yes.
I was just going to ask if that is also an opportunity to comment on any further economic data or labour force data.
Well, I think if there's any further data emerging, it would be helpful for us to receive information about it, and that's obviously an invitation to all of you at the bar table,
Yes.
if that's the case.
Yes, I was thinking just of some of the labour force data that's just come out.
Yes, that would be most
Yeah.
helpful if that occurs. Thank
Certainly.
you.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner.
Mr. Moss, from CCI's perspective.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. Just a few comments in response to some of the matters that have been raised. First of all, I would just clarify that we still do rely on our submission reply. Nothing that's been said post my submission changes that at all. I would just like to clarify that there's not a common view that the minimum wage should be set as a percentage of annual wage. I think that's a little bit optimistic of Dr. Diamond in that respect. And I would reinforce that we have a concern to simply say that because wage price index hasn't responded in the way in which Unions WA suggested it should do, that the supply and demand model is not working. Information has been provided from Treasury, from CCI, some commentary with respect to the RBA, which suggests that that is working. It's working in a slightly different way. And we'd also note that the table provided by Mr. Christmas at page 35 of his submission with respect to labour scarcity, or labour market tightness, I should say, and wage price index indicates there's lag effect, both in wage price index increasing and wage price index decreasing. We would also note that a very similar response comes out when you look at labour underutilisation and wage price index as well. The modelling of the graph is very similar in that respect. I'd also like to clarify that our comment with respect to the dominance of the mining sector within the WA economy is not an indication that the other sectors are freeloading, for the want of a better term. All sectors...
I don't think it was put in that way, quite that way. I think there's a recognition that all sectors are pulling their weight.
And precisely, we'd clarify that that's the case. The issue is when you look at the dominance that the mining sector has on the WA economy, if for whatever reason you took that away, the state of the WA economy would be a very different scenario.
It no doubt makes a very major contribution, that's clear.
Yes, that's right. Just on some of the comments made by WACOS, I just reinforce that we do note the concerns coming from WACOS about the impact that some households are having and the challenges that they're facing. But reiterate that the minimum wage isn't a cure for all ills. And in particular, it's very difficult for the minimum wage to take into account the variety of different household types and the pressures that sit upon them. And it's not necessarily in line that the minimum wage is designed to, deal with a particular household type, or a variety of different household types in dealing with that.
There's the interaction of the tax and transfer system, which of course is integral to assist low-paid households, but I think the submission from Mr. Twomey in particular was the importance of maintaining a standard of living for those who are employed. That seemed to be what he was trying to put to us.
Yes, that's right. And that is an objective, a very strong objective of the minimum wage as well. We're not suggesting it's a one or the other type approach. There is a balancing act in that respect, but it is important to recognise there's a limitation about how far the minimum wage can address a lot of these concerns, and that doesn't mean those concerns are any less valid. It means that the solutions that we need to be looking at need to take into account a wider range of matters in that respect. Things like the electricity credit, we do say is targeted. It's targeted towards offsetting electricity costs. but it's not necessarily targeted in the way in which WACOS is identifying it could otherwise have been targeted. I don't think it changes the fact that it's a targeted approach. The issue is that there might be argument about whether things like this could be better targeted in that respect. And we would notice comments around more affordable housing in the outer suburbs and that can have cost implications. Once again, there are things that have been put into place to help address that. So the cap on public transport fees is a way of helping to minimise that cost. And we'd also note that people living in the outer suburbs may also work within their local area as well, because within those outer suburbs you've also got the provisions of retail and hospitality, childcare and other services as well. So whilst there may be some people having to come into Perth, and that is of course a longer distance, likewise there are employment opportunities within those areas too. And just a comment on the young workers being disadvantaged in employment when entering into the labour market in a recession. That clearly can be a situation, but our view is that disadvantage is arising out of lack of employment opportunities and lack of opportunities to develop skills and experience and to obtain training, not necessarily as a direct reflection of the cost of living. In that respect. If it's pleased the Commission, those are the comments in response.
Thank you very much, Mr Moss. Dr Diamond, anything you wish to add?
Thank you very much, Chief Commissioner. Excuse me. So yes, just in relation to a few of the things that have been said, yes, we agree that the minimum wage is certainly not the only measure by which you would address poverty and inequality. I guess where we would differ is we say that nothing else is likely to work, whether you're talking about the tax transfer system, the welfare system, nothing else is likely to work unless we have a robust and regular set of wage increases that ensures that paid work, full-time paid work, actually pays. And the virtuous circle between the paid workforce and the tax transfer system is precisely what addresses inequality and relative deprivation. We'd just like to note that, of course, in various ways, the CPI inflation has been going up before we've had the wage growth, not after. And that generally speaking, we would say that there's very little indication that the current state of CPI inflation is necessarily going to lead to deleterious effects on, or at least no more deleterious effects on employers than what has been shown already. Part of what we've been talking about with the issues around sort of industry contributions to growth state product is certainly acknowledging that issues around productivity are certainly hard to measure at the level of minimum wage employers. But if you simply choose the biggest industry in terms of economic growth and just decide to sort of count that, then you really sort of obscure a great deal. Yes, if you took away mining, WA would look very different. If you took away the other industries, mining would look very different here in WA as well. It's all, as the Chief Commissioner says, it all brings together. And the insistence on sort of emphasising the gross state product in that regard really, we would say, is more sort of obscuring than illuminating in terms of how the WA economy actually works and how we should think about wages. Our 7.6% claim is a reflection of the lagging response of wages that has been mentioned, the low to no real wage growth that we highlighted in the sort of mini submission that we just did, handed up for people to consider. That's a situation of low wage growth is also ensuring, of course, that many people are working multiple jobs. Which is certainly sort of going to impact the employment growth that people are looking forward to in order for people to capture the full value of the current robust economic growth. We would please the Commission to say that look, we think that the 7.6% claim by ourselves and WACOS is a recognition of where low-wage employees need to be in order for them to sort of capture the full value of the contribution they are making to the WA economy and the national economy as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Dyer. I don't know if there's anything further you wish to add at all. I think, Mr. Twomey, you've had the benefit of having the final submission, so you've probably picked up things on the way, so thank you very much. Very well. Well, we thank you very much for your efforts in your written submissions and your oral submissions today. They've been helpful to us in trying to grapple with the issues we have to grapple with on this occasion. As we've indicated, our programming is that we will now adjourn until the decision of the Fair Work Commission annual review is handed down, and we'll sit shortly after that and hear further from you at that time. Okay, we'll adjourn. Thank you.
We stand adjourned.